Well, you're probably curious about the title of our study this morning, so let's start with that. It's based on an account, as you can see, found in 1 Samuel, the 16th chapter. In the previous chapter there, in chapter 15, God had instructed King Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites. And if you recall, Saul instead spared King Agag and the best of the livestock. And so when Samuel confronted him, Saul argued that he and the people had only spared these animals in order to sacrifice them to God. And Samuel responded with that famous quote in 1 Samuel 15 and 22 when he said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams." And even though it grieved Samuel, he went on to declare that God would tear the kingdom from Saul and give it to another. And so now at the beginning of chapter 16, we read, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons.' And Samuel said, 'How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me.' And the Lord said, 'Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you.' Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem." Tara was reading a book recently, and she showed me a chapter where the author pointed out that this journey that Samuel took from Ramah, which is where he was, to Bethlehem, which is where Jesse lived, was only about 11 miles as the crow flies. However, the author made this statement. He said, Samuel's traveling companion was not a crow. We can't imagine how difficult an 11-plus mile trip on foot would be, much less while leading a heifer. I think it's very likely that he had to fight the urge to kill the stubborn thing long before he ever made it to Jesse's. And the point is, I think sometimes we're guilty of maybe romanticizing obedience. We read stories such as this in the Bible and the accounts of those who just faithfully did whatever God asked of them. We never stop to realize how difficult it most certainly must have been. And I have to admit, as teachers and maybe even as preachers and evangelists, sometimes we oversimplify obedience as well. After all you have to do is obey. Just do what the Bible says. That's all you have to do. But we fail to recognize the difficulties that sometimes arise for certain individuals in certain situations. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that in any way, because it's hard, that excuses disobedience. But what I'm saying is that we should not always idealize the Christian life as if it's just lollipops and gumdrops. To put it plainly, sometimes obedience is hard. But, that really should not come as a surprise. Jesus promised as much in John 16 and verse 33. He plainly said, "In this world you will have tribulation." Period. In Matthew 7 and 14, he said, "Narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life." The apostles and particularly the Apostle Paul echoed Jesus' words. He wrote in 2 Timothy 3 and 12, "Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." Jesus and his apostles did not want followers of Christ to enter the Christian race with rose-tinted glasses. It's only fair to know what we've signed up for. They say that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And so have you ever wondered why rivers and streams are so crooked? If the water is trying to get where it's going, why didn't it just flow straight? Well, they wind left and right instead of flowing in a straight line because when water flows, it seeks out the path of least resistance. If a tree or a hill or something else gets in its way, most of the time water just flows around it. The same is true of our roads. Around here, we have maybe some of the curviest roads in the country. Why is that? Why didn't they just build the roads in a straight line? Wouldn't that have been certainly much safer for travelers, and wouldn't that have taken less materials, maybe saved money, been easier on my tires, I know, if all our roads were straight? But of course, the answer is that most of our roads are built on and based on roads of many, many years ago. And back then, most people traveled on a path of least resistance. Again, if there was a tree or a hill or something else in the way, they just went around it. If farmer so-and-so didn't want anybody passing through his land, then folks just went around it. It's this path of least resistance that makes our rivers and our roads so crooked. But the same can be said of our lives. If we live life by always following the path of least resistance, by just taking the easy way, then it can make us crooked, so to speak, as well. Doing the easy thing is a dangerous way to live. And frankly, we cannot please God if we always do the easy thing, because obeying God sometimes requires doing things that are not easy. We can't just pick and choose the parts of God's law that we want to obey, the easy stuff, so to speak, and leave the rest undone. James 2 and verse 10 teaches that we stand condemned by the whole law when we violate any part of it. And the test of true faith is whether we obey when it's hard to obey. When it comes to obeying in these hard situations, certainly we can find no greater example than Jesus Christ. In Hebrews 5, verses 7 through 8, we read, "In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered." Jesus knew firsthand that sometimes obedience is hard. There's a story that's told about a past governor of Massachusetts back in the 50s when he was running for his second term. And one day on the campaign trail, after a very busy morning chasing votes and no time to stop for lunch, he arrived at a barbecue. It was late in the afternoon, and he was starving. And so as he moved down the serving line, he held out his plate to the woman serving chicken. And she put a piece on his plate, and she turned to the next person in line, and the governor said, "Excuse me, do you mind if I have another piece of chicken?" And the woman said, "Sorry, I'm supposed to just give one piece to each person." He said, "But I'm hungry." She said, "I'm sorry, but my orders are only one per customer." The governor, even though he may have been a down-to-earth man, he decided that this would be time to throw a little weight around. And so he looked at her one more time and he said, "Do you know who I am? I'm the governor of this state." And the woman replied, "Do you know who I am? I'm the lady in charge of the chicken. Now move along." I told that story to illustrate the point that sometimes obedience is hard. This woman obeyed her orders, even though it might have seemed a lot easier just to put another piece of chicken on the governor's plate, just to follow the path of least resistance. And like her, we too often face the temptation to disobey our orders, if you will, when it comes to God's commands. There are many times when it seems going against God's will would just be a lot easier path for us to take. But as I said, the true test of faith is whether we obey in these hard situations. And so for a little while this morning, I want us to take a closer look at some of these times when it's hard to obey. First of all, the first case we'll notice is that it's hard to obey when I'm just not in the mood. Now, this one may sound a little lame, so to speak. We may think, well, that's never true of me. I'm not going to disobey just because I'm not in the mood. But I'm afraid that really may be one of the top reasons why we do often disobey God. We all have our moods, and those moods affect everything we do, from our communication and our interaction with each other to fulfilling our responsibilities at home and at work, and yes, our responsibilities to the Lord as well. Sometimes we just don't feel like it. But if we refuse to do the right thing when we simply don't feel like it, what does that say about our commitment to God? It's really no commitment at all. What if God was not in the mood to sustain the universe? I need to add here that I don't think God has moods, at least not mood swings like you and I do. The Bible teaches us that He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, according to Hebrews 13 and 8. But what if He did have moods like you and me? What if He didn't feel like lighting the sun one day? Or didn't feel like holding the earth in orbit? I hope you see my point. If we're not in the mood to obey God, then we need to change our mood quickly. We need to resolve to be ready in season and out of season, according to 2 Timothy 4 and 2. Other versions translate that word ready there as urgent. And so we need to always be ready and urgent to obey God, no matter what our feelings or mood might be. In Mark 12 and verse 30, Jesus told us that the number one commandment was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And that really doesn't leave any room for moodiness, does it? If we love God that much, no kind of mood will tempt us to disobey Him. Because in reality, not being in the mood to obey God is really just outright disobedience, and it's disrespect towards God. Well, next, it's also hard sometimes to obey when it's not convenient. Now, again, that may sound like kind of like the first excuse that we just noticed. It may sound a little lame. Maybe it sounds pretty similar. But obedience when we're not in the mood, by that I meant more to do with our own personal feelings. As I said, when I don't feel like it. And that's something that we're in control of. That's something that we can change. But when we talk about obedience when it's not convenient, that could be the circumstances around us that perhaps are out of our control. Felix is a classic example of someone who postponed doing the right thing until it was convenient. You remember in Acts 24 and 25, the Apostle Paul preached to the governor about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come. The Bible tells us that his message was so powerful that Felix was alarmed, that he was afraid. In fact, the King James Version says that he trembled. But for some reason, in Felix's mind, this was not the best time for him to commit to obedience. For some reason, it was inconvenient. And he told Paul to go away until he had a more convenient time, and he would call for him. As far as we know, that time never came. And that's the point. That's the snare that Satan lays for us, because that convenient season will never come if he has anything to do with it. If we think we will just delay obedience until it becomes easier, then usually we find that it only becomes harder and harder. Remember the rich young ruler who came to Jesus in Matthew, the 19th chapter. He thought he was ready to obey. But when Jesus told him to sell all he had and to follow him, he sadly walked away. I guess we could say that the cost of discipleship rises with time. And if we feel like it's inconvenient or if it's too costly now, chances are that will be even more, that will even be more the case later on. If we're not careful, we may find that our schedule and our routines and our habits and so on are more important to us than the Lord's will. If we realize that this is true of us, then how can we fulfill what the Lord requires? Well, Jesus gives us a simple yet profound answer in Matthew 6 and 33 when he says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. We have to put God and our obedience to him first at the top of our list. It's possible to be so busy, to be so obsessed by our usual routine that the Lord practically has to make an appointment if he needs us for anything. But how would we like it if the Lord treated us that way? You know, we can go to the Lord at any moment, and he will always be there for us. And we have to have the same open schedule, if you will, for him at all times. The real work of the Lord rarely fits into the neat pattern of convenient openings in our lives. If we are involved in the Lord's work, then it often involves the same kind of disruptions that a new baby brings into a household. When a baby needs something, he or she needs it right then. Some things can't wait, even at 3 o'clock in the morning. And likewise, there are a lot of things in the Lord's work that cannot be put on the back burner. Obedience to the commands of God are not always convenient. For example, going to worship services is not always convenient. There are many brethren in this country who drive over an hour one way to worship on Lord's Day, maybe even at midweek services as well. But better yet, we have brothers and sisters in other countries who walk for hours, many, many miles, just to assemble with the Lord's church. I spoke with a brother the other day who had paid for a European cruise, but the only faithful congregation in that area of the world was in London, and unfortunately, that did not line up with the itinerary for the trip to be in that city on Lord's Day. And so he and his wife flew to London. They missed the first leg of the cruise. And then they flew to the next city where the boat ported, and they joined the cruise there. Now, people in the world would think, what a lot of trouble. How inconvenient. But it was an inconvenience that he was willing to go through, because missing the Lord's Day worship was not an option for him. And if there had not been a way to work it out, then the only other option would have been not to take the trip in the first place. Well, likewise, there are many other areas of our Christian life that are not always convenient. As we said, worship, Bible study is not always convenient. Helping others is not always convenient. Standing for the truth will not always be convenient. In short, obedience is not always convenient, but it's necessary in order to please God and in order to receive our reward. Well, next this morning, it's also hard sometimes to obey when I don't understand why God has required something. Almost every child reaches the age when they want to know why about everything. And some of this curiosity is good for them because it helps them to learn about the world around them. But as parents, those whys can also drive us crazy sometimes, especially if the child is questioning something that you've told him or her to do. Go pick up your toys. Why? Because that's one of your jobs. Why? Because we need to keep our house clean. Why? Well, because I said so. And as I said, those why questions can drive us crazy. But then we as adults, we're often guilty of the same thing. We may not always understand the why of God's will. Sometimes we just have to have enough faith to trust God when we can't see where He's going with His will for our lives. We have to believe that He sees and He knows what's best. People of true faith have always trusted God enough to obey. Noah trusted God enough to build an ark, even though he may not have understood. Maybe you've heard the act of a famous comedian where he imagines this conversation between God and Noah and what it might have sounded like. Noah, I want you to build an ark. What's an ark? Well, it's going to rain. What's rain? Noah must have had lots of questions, lots of whys in his mind. He had never seen it rain before, at least not enough to cause any kind of flooding. And so why did he need this big boat? And why were God's instructions for him so tedious and detailed? Why did he have to use gopher wood? Maybe there was a perfectly good pine tree forest nearby. Why only put one window? Is it going to get stuffy in there? And the point is, Noah trusted God enough to obey him, even though he may not have understood all the whys. Think about Abraham. He must have had lots of questions about God's instructions, beginning with those we read in Genesis 12 and verse 1, when he said, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Why did he have to leave his family and his home? And why couldn't God tell him where he was going? But he obeyed. Later in Genesis 22nd chapter, God instructed him to take Isaac, his son, up on a mountain and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. Why? After God had promised Isaac to him as a son in his old age, why would he now ask him to kill him? Once again, Abraham must have had many questions, but he obeyed. And these and many more serve as examples of faith to us, those who obeyed even when they must not have understood God's plan. Today, we may not understand why we're only to sing a cappella in our worship, but that's what God said according to Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. We may not understand why adultery is the only scriptural grounds for divorce and remarriage, but that's what God said, Matthew 19:9. We may not understand why baptism is necessary for our salvation, but that's what God said, Mark 16:16, Acts 2:38, many other verses we could quote. We may not understand why Christian women are required to let their hair grow, but that's what God said, 1 Corinthians 11th chapter. And in many of these cases, obedience can be hard. Just ask the man whose first marriage has fallen apart, but not for reasons of adultery. And so he knows that he can never scripturally marry again. That's hard. Ask our sisters who sacrifice the time and the effort required to care for their long hair, not to mention the ridicule they may sometimes receive from those in the world. It's hard. And if we might not understand why God has required these things, it only adds to the difficulty. But when all is said and done, it may be that as we increase in knowledge and wisdom, that these things become clear to us why God commanded them. Or it may be that we never know, at least not in this life. Maybe we can ask God ourselves in person someday. The point is, understanding isn't always necessary. Understanding can wait, but obedience cannot. Well, next, it's also hard sometimes to obey when it could embarrass me or perhaps even endanger me. Ken Galbraith was one of the most respected economists in American history. In fact, he offered economic advice to at least 4 U.S. presidents, from Franklin Roosevelt to Lyndon Johnson. And in his autobiography, he wrote a story about the devotion of his family's most trusted housekeeper, Miss Emily Wilson. He said, "It had been a very tiring day, and I asked Emily to hold all telephone calls while I took a nap. And shortly thereafter, the phone rang. It was President Johnson who was calling from the White House. 'Get me Ken Galbraith. This is Lyndon Johnson.' 'He's sleeping, Mr. President. He said not to disturb him.' 'Well, wake him up. I want to talk to him.' And Miss Emily replied, 'No, Mr. President. I work for him, not you.' You have to admit, that took some guts. Miss Emily could easily have chosen to wake up Mr. Galbraith, even though he had told her not to. I'm sure she was embarrassed when she had to tell the president no. And maybe she even was concerned that might get her into trouble, maybe make her lose her job. But she stood her ground and she obeyed her boss's orders, despite what she might have to face. You know, we often use the word hypocrite to describe a person who comes to church on Sunday mornings and pretends to be godly, but they live the rest of the week in a manner that's anything but godly. But the word hypocrite can also describe a person who's scared to admit they're a Christian and scared to obey God's commands in order to avoid being embarrassed by what others think or for fear of the earthly consequences. There were some of the chief rulers in Jesus' day that let others' opinions keep them from obeying. In John 12, verses 42 and 43, we read, "Nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogues. For they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God." Of course, we're all familiar with the story of Peter, who was embarrassed, maybe even scared, to the point that he denied the Lord 3 times. Just like Peter, if we refuse to obey God because of embarrassment or fear, then we are guilty of denying the Lord. And for that person, Jesus gave this warning in Mark 8 and verse 38. He said, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Yes, it may sometimes be difficult to obey or to stand up for what God has told us to do because of fear or because of embarrassment, but Jesus gives us plenty of motivation to obey if we want to receive his support on the day of judgment. Well, finally this morning, it's hard to obey when I simply prefer to do otherwise. Let's be honest. Sometimes we just don't want to do things the way God has commanded us to. Our own will is different from the will of God, and so we follow our own will. Let me illustrate or share with you something that I think illustrates this point. I'm told that in the deserts of the Middle East, Arabian horses go through a rigorous training before they can be trusted to carry soldiers or others across those lands. The trainers require absolute obedience from the horses, and they test them to see if they are completely trained. The final test really is almost beyond the endurance of any living thing. The trainer forces the horses to go without water for days, and then he turns them loose. And of course, they start running towards the nearest source of water. But just as they get to the edge, ready to jump in and drink, the trainer blows his whistle. And the horses who have been completely trained, who have learned perfect obedience, they stop and they turn around and they come back to the trainer. And they stand there probably quivering, wanting water, but they wait in perfect obedience. And when the trainer is sure that he has their obedience, he gives them a signal to go and to drink. Now, certainly this to us may sound severe, but if you're in the deserts of Arabia and your life is entrusted to a horse, you better be sure that you have one who is trained to obey you. And likewise, we must accept God's training and we must obey him. Often our own human will and our own wisdom and our emotions can interfere with our obedience. Proverbs 14 and 12 says, "There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." Again, people of true faith have always been willing to put down their own self-will in order to obey God's will. Again, think of Abraham. Imagine how strong that urge must have been to grab his son and run as fast as he could away from that altar. Naaman is an example of someone who did almost let his own will, his own human wisdom, keep him from obeying. He thought Elisha the prophet would wave his hand over him and heal his leprosy. And he certainly didn't want to wash in that dirty old Jordan River. But wasn't he thankful that he came to his senses and obeyed God instead? And of course, the perfect example, as we've already pointed out, of someone who obeyed God's will, even when maybe he preferred something else, was Jesus. We read earlier in Hebrews 5 that he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus pleaded with the Father to let the cup pass from him. Matthew 26 and 39, it says, "He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.'" Jesus loved us enough to be willing to die at Calvary for our salvation. But in that moment, he too wished that there was some other way to accomplish it. But as we know, he obeyed God's will. It's often hard to obey God when our preference is otherwise. But if we keep the Savior and his sacrifice for us centered in our minds, then we too should be willing to obey. And so, in conclusion this morning, what is the key to obedience? How do we learn to obey even when it may seem hard to do? The Apostle Paul offered some advice along these lines. Paul said that to be consistently obedient, he had to discipline himself. He wrote in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, beginning with verse 24, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, crown, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Self-discipline is vital to our pleasing God and to returning or to receiving that eternal home in heaven. Of course, Jesus is the supreme example of consistent obedience as well as self-discipline. Hebrews 12:2 says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Just like Jesus, we must keep our eyes on the joy that is set before us. This morning, we've noticed sometimes when honestly obedience can be hard. At least it appears to us as humans that it's hard. But if we do keep our eyes on that final prize, if we have that true eternal perspective, then we'll realize that disobedience in the long run is the hard way. Jesus described his way as the way of rest, Matthew 11:28. And so let us all strive to let nothing stand in our way of being obedient to the Lord and receiving that eternal rest.